On the 17th evening, my old mule finally leaned his whole weight against the rusted iron door at the base of the grain silo and pushed until the bottom hinge tore out of the concrete with a groan I felt in my teeth. And the dry, sweet, dusty smell that breathed out of that black gap was the smell of something that had been waiting 80 years to be found. Solomon was a draft mule, 19 hands of him gone gray at the muzzle, 1,200 pounds of bone and patience, and in the year I had owned him, he had never once broken a fence or shouldered a gate or done a single willful thing. He was the gentlest animal I had ever stood beside. He waited the way the old working ones wait, with his head low and his long ears slack, and his great dark eyes half closed, as if the whole hurrying world were a thing he had decided long ago to forgive. So when I came out across the dead wheat field through the long amber light of that Kansas evening and found him with his huge shoulder set against that sealed silo door, shoving with the slow, terrible strength of a creature that could pull a stump out of the prairie if it cared to, I did not yell at him. I had learned over 17 days of watching him drift back to that exact spot at the foot of the silo that he was not being a bad mule. He was trying to show me something, and he had simply run out of patience with my not seeing it. My name is Hannah, and I was 41 years old that fall, and I had bought a foreclosed wheat farm at a county tax sale for almost nothing, because it was the only piece of the world that would have me. I wanted to be plain about how I came to be standing in that field, because there is nothing pretty in it. A year and a half before, I had been a bookkeeper in Wichita with a husband in a brick house and a future I thought was poured solid. Then my husband got sick, the slow, expensive kind of sick, and we spent everything we had keeping him comfortable. And then we spent everything we did not have. And then he died anyway, in a hospital bed in the front room while I held his hand. When the debts came due, the brick house went to the bank, and the cars went, and the savings had gone long before, and at 41 I found myself with a suitcase, a box of his books I could not make myself sell, and a credit no banker in the state would touch. I had grown up on a farm out near the Nebraska line, the daughter of people who were gone now, and some stubborn root in me wanted dirt under my feet again, dirt that belonged to me and not to any lender. There are things nobody tells you about the kind of loss that comes with a long illness, the worst of which is that you grieve in two directions at once, forward into the empty years you will have to live, and backward into all the money and the hope you poured into a fight you were never going to win. I had sat by that hospital bed in the front room of the brick house for the better part of a year, reading him his westerns when his eyes got too tired to read them himself. And when he was gone, I found that I did not know how to be a person who was not waiting on someone. And the silence of a house with no one to wait on was the loudest thing I had ever heard. The lawyers and the bankers came at me kindly enough, the way men do when there is nothing left to take but the last small dignity, and I signed what they put in front of me and watched my whole settled life get carried off in pieces. And I did not cry, because I had used up the crying on the man himself, and there was none left over for the furniture. So when the county put up a quarter section of failed wheat ground near a near-dead town called Harlow, with a collapsing house and 3 leaning outbuildings and 1 tall concrete grain silo, and the back taxes on it came to less than I had folded in my wallet, I drove out to look at it. and I signed the paper that same afternoon. And for the first time since I had watched the only man I ever loved stop breathing, I felt something that was not quite hope, but was at least its cousin. I should tell you about Solomon because the getting of him is half of everything that happened. I did not set out to own a mule. A week after I took the farm, an old man 2 roads over named Pruitt, who was selling off his stock because his hands had gone bad with arthritis and he could not work them any more, had a gray draft mule he could not move. Nobody wanted a 19-year-old mule. They wanted tractors. They wanted young horses. They wanted anything but a slow old animal that ate every day and could not be ridden hard. Pruitt told me he had been raised in harness, that he had pulled a plow and a hay wagon and a stone boat his whole life, that he was sound and sweet and worth 10 of the young fools that bit and kicked, and that the kill buyer was coming Thursday if nobody took him by then. I had $11 to spare and no business owning a mule. I took him for the $11. I think I took him because he looked at me over the rail of that pen with the same expression I had been seeing in my own mirror for a year and a half. The look of something that had given a whole life over to one purpose and then watched that purpose taken away and did not understand what it was supposed to do now. We were, the 2 of us, exactly alike, a widow and a worn-out mule that the world had finished with, and I led him home on a frayed rope down 2 miles of gravel road in the last of the daylight, and he came without a single balk, putting his big, careful feet down beside mine as if he had been waiting his whole life for someone to walk him somewhere worth going. He settled into the leaning barn as though he had always lived there. He learned the shape of my days inside a week. In the mornings, I would come out with the gray light, and he would be standing at the fence waiting, and he would press his great soft nose against my chest and breathe, and on the nights when the grief came up out of the floor of that broken farmhouse and sat on my chest like a stone, it was the slow sound of that old mule shifting his weight in the barn outside my window that kept me on the right side of the dark. So, when I tell you I bought a failed farm at a tax sale, understand I did not face it alone. I faced it with a discarded mule, and the 2 of us, the cast-off woman and the cast-off animal, set ourselves the task of making something out of a place nobody else would have. That is the company I kept that autumn near Harlow, Kansas. The grain silo stood at the north edge of the yard, the tallest thing for a mile in any direction, a column of old poured concrete maybe 60 feet high and 20 across, the kind they built in the 20s and 30s before the steel bins came in. The man at the county office had told me it dated to about 1931, that the farm had been one of the big wheat operations before the dust years broke it, and that the silo had been sealed up tight for as long as anyone living could remember. There was a low iron door set into the concrete at its base, rusted the deep red of dried blood, and it had a heavy old hasp on it without a lock, just swollen shut with 80 years of rust and grit. And when I had first walked the property, I had given it a tug and it had not moved, and I had thought, with the weary practicality of a broke woman, that whatever was in there was either empty or full of rotted grain, and either way, it could wait. I had a house with a hole in the roof and a well I was not sure of and a winter coming. The silo was the least of my worries. Solomon thought differently. It was on the 3rd day that he first refused to leave it. We had a routine by then. I would let him out of the barn in the morning, to graze the dead field and crop the weeds along the fence. And he would amble and doze and follow me while I worked, the way a dog follows, never far. But on that third morning, he walked straight across the yard to the foot of the silo and put his nose to the bottom of that rusted iron door and stood there. I called him to come help me drag fallen limbs off the lane, and a draft mule that does not want to come is not a thing flesh can argue with. You might as well try to move the silo itself. He stood with his head lowered and his ears swiveled forward, which for him was a great show of attention, and a low sound came out of him, not a bray and not a groan, but something soft and troubled deep in his chest, a sound I had not heard him make before. I went over and looked at the door. It was a rusted iron door at the base of a concrete silo. There was nothing about it. I rapped on it, and it gave the dull, dead thud of a thing packed solid behind. I coaxed him away with half an apple, and he came, but he turned his head and looked back at the silo 3 times as we crossed the yard, the way you look back at a person you have not finished talking to. The 4th morning, he went straight there again. The 5th morning, too. By the end of that first week, the foot of the grain silo had become the center of my mule's whole existence. He grazed, he dozed, he followed me through my chores, but every idle hour he spent standing pressed against that iron door with his nose down at the bottom of it, and now and then he would lift one great hoof and paw at the concrete sill, slow and deliberate, just 2 or 3 drags, and then sigh his huge sighing breath and lower his head and go back to his waiting. I told myself the sensible things. A varmint had denned up under the door. The concrete held the warmth of the afternoon sun, and he liked to stand in it. There were old oats spilled at the base from the loading days, and he could smell the ghost of them. But I had walked that gravel road home beside him, and I had worked a year of dawns with him at my elbow, and I knew the difference between a mule enjoying a smell and a mule standing guard. Solomon was standing guard. He had found something in the foot of that silo, and he had decided, in whatever way an animal decides such things, that it was his job to mind it until I was ready to understand. I started keeping a little record of it, scratched in the back of one of my husband's books, the way you write a thing down hoping the writing will make a pattern show itself. Day 6, he pawed the sill 9 times before I let him off. Day 7, he would not take his morning grain until he had walked to the silo first and stood at the door a while, as though reporting for a shift. Day 9, I woke in the black middle of the night to a sound and went out with my flashlight and found him gone from the barn, standing at the foot of the silo in the cold under a sky thick with stars, his gray hide silver in the beam, his nose against the iron. And when I came to him, he did not startle and did not move. He only turned one ear toward me and let out that low, troubled breath and pressed harder against the door, as if to say, I am sorry, but I cannot come in yet. There is something here I have not finished. I stood with him in that cold for a long while, my hand on his warm shoulder, the 2 of us at the base of a thing built before either of us was born, and I felt the first cold edge of a thought I could not yet say out loud, which was that my mule was not confused. My mule was waiting on something and grieving over something, and I was the one too dull to understand. The weather turned against me before the question got settled. The first hard cold of the year came down out of the plains in the middle of October, and a freezing rain glazed everything and I worried about a 19-year-old animal standing out at that door for hours in the wet. I had no money for a vet if he took sick, no more than I had money for anything. So on the 17th day, I made up my mind that if I could not coax him off the spot, I would simply answer the question for both of us. I would get that rusted door open, show him the empty dark or the rotted grain behind it, and put the whole business to rest before the cold did him real harm. Except I never got to choose my moment, because that was the evening Solomon opened it himself. I had gone out at dusk to bring him in, and he was already at the door, and there was an urgency in him I had not seen. His big haunches dropped and driving, his shoulders set low against the iron, 1,200 pounds of him pushing in slow heaves while the old hinges shrieked. I called his name and ran across the field, and just as I reached him, the bottom hinge tore clean out of the rotten concrete, and the door sagged inward a hand's width, and the smell came out. Not rot, not dead grain. It was a dry, sweet, dusty mineral smell, the smell of a sealed place where the air had not stirred in a lifetime, and riding underneath it, faint and impossible, the warm brown smell of old paper and old wood and something almost like cured tobacco. Solomon backed off the moment the seal broke. He stood square and dropped his head and looked at me, and I will tell you that the look on that old mule's face was relief, the bone-deep relief of a creature that has labored a long time to make itself understood and has finally gotten through. It took me the better part of an hour with a pry bar and a length of pipe to work the rest of that door free, because my hands had started shaking and would not stop, and when it finally came loose and fell flat against the dead grass with a clang, I crouched at the black mouth of the opening and shone my flashlight in, and I understood at last why my mule had not been able to let it go. It was not a silo full of grain. The grain was there, yes, a great cone of it, sloped up into the darkness above, dry as bone and gone to dust at the surface, but down at the bottom, in the angle where the round wall met the floor, someone had built a room. A little board-walled chamber, maybe 8 feet square, had been framed into the base of the silo against the inside of the concrete, with a low door of its own and a plank floor raised up off the ground, and it was dry, perfectly dry, the way the hole-sealed shaft above it was dry, because concrete and a tight iron door and 80 years of stillness will keep the prairie damp out as well as anything man ever made. My flashlight beam crawled across that little room and found things. It found a narrow iron cot with a folded gray blanket on it. It found a small sheet iron stove with its pipe run up through the wall. It found a shelf of tin cans and mason jars furred with dust, and a wooden crate, and a kerosene lamp, and a tin trunk with the paint worn off its corners. And on a nail beside the cot it found a man's coat, a heavy canvas barn coat gone stiff with age, hanging exactly where its owner had hung it on the last day he ever stood in that room. I had not bought a sealed grain silo. I had bought a hiding place that the world had forgotten was there. I went in on my hands and knees through the little door, with Solomon's great head pushed in at the outer opening behind me, too big to follow, breathing his warm breath into the cold dark. I stood up inside that dry boardroom with my breath clouding white, and I turned my light slowly around it, and I saw that a man had lived here once, lived here in secret, and lived here long. There were marks scratched into the board wall in neat columns, hundreds of them, tally marks counting off days the way a prisoner counts. There was a Bible on the crate with a ribbon in it, and there was the tin trunk, and I knelt down in front of it and worked the latch and lifted the lid, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth and laid down with great care, were papers, not money, letters and ledgers, and a thick stack of pages covered edge to edge in a careful, slanting hand. I lifted out the topmost page and held it to the light and read the first line of it, and the breath went out of me. "Whoever finds this," it began, "I am not the thief they will tell you I was, and the truth of what happened in the autumn of 1931 is set down in these pages, so that someday somebody will know it. I want to tell you I read it for the right reasons, but the truth is mixed, the way truth always is. Part of me, the broke and frightened part, had knelt at that trunk hoping for cash, for old gold coin, for a buried fortune that could fix the roof and the well and the whole sinking ship of my life. But the moment I began to read those pages, that part of me went quiet and stayed quiet, because what I had found was not a fortune. It was a man. His name was Eli Mercer, and the pages were his account of himself, written in that little room over the course of a winter and a spring, and as I sat down on the dusty plank floor and read them by flashlight with my old mule breathing in the doorway, the whole lost story rose up around me out of the dark. Eli Mercer had been the hired hand on this farm in 1931, when it belonged to a hard, rich wheat man named Garrett, and in the autumn of that terrible year, with the dust beginning and the banks failing and men desperate all across the plains, a strong box of payroll cash had gone missing out of the Garrett farmhouse, and Eli, the hired man, the poor man, the easy man to blame, had been accused of stealing it. He had not taken it. The pages laid out in patient detail who truly had and why, but that is the family story to tell, and I will keep it for them. What mattered, what came up off those pages and put its hand on my heart, was this. Eli had run because a poor man accused in 1931 did not get justice. He got a rope or a prison that was nearly the same thing, and he had run only as far as the one place on that whole farm nobody ever went, the sealed grain silo, and old Garrett's daughter, a girl named Ada, who knew he was innocent and loved him, had hidden him there. She had framed that little room with him through the cold nights and stocked it with cans and kerosene, and brought him food across the dead fields under the stars, and they had planned, the two of them, to wait out the worst of the manhunt and then slip away west together in the spring and start a life where no one knew their names. The letters in the trunk were hers. Hundreds of small folded letters that she had carried to him in the dark, and that he had answered and could not send, and had kept. Every one. I read a good many of them there on the plank floor that first night, and they were not grand letters. They were the small daily letters of two people in love who had only the dark hours to be in love in. She wrote him about the weather and the wheat, and which of her father's men were still looking for him down by the river. And she wrote him what she had brought, a jar of beans, a heel of bread, a twist of the good tobacco he liked, and at the bottom of every one of them, in a hand that got steadier as the winter went on, she wrote that the spring was coming and that he was to keep his courage, that she had a cousin in Oregon who would take them in and ask no questions, that she had already begun in secret to set aside what little money was her own. And he wrote back on the same paper, turned over, the things a hidden man writes, that he was not afraid for himself, but only for her, that if it ever came to it, she was to deny she had ever known where he was, that he would sooner hang than see her shamed for loving him. The tally marks on the wall were the days he had counted waiting for the spring she promised, neat columns of them scratched with a nail, and I sat and looked at those columns for a long time, because I knew, the way you know a thing in your body before your mind will say it, that there were too many of them, that the marks went on well past any spring, and that something had gone wrong in that little room that the letters had not yet told me. The story did not end the way the two of them had planned, and I will not lay the whole of it out here, because the family, the historical people, finally found deserves to hear it first and whole. But I will tell you that Eli Mercer did not get his spring. The pages stop in April. The last page is dated, and it is not in his hand, but in hers. A single line written in a grief so old it had soaked into the paper, and it says only, "He is gone now, and I have sealed the door, and I will carry what we were until I cannot carry it any more, and may God forgive this town for what it did to a good man." Ada Garrett had walled up the room with her own hands and sealed the iron door, and let the whole county go on believing that the hired man, Eli Mercer, had stolen the payroll and fled west and gotten away with it, because the truth would have done him no good in the ground and would have ruined her, and she had carried the weight of it, alone, in silence, into wherever the long years finally took her. For more than 80 years, a good man had lain under the false name of thief, and the proof of his innocence had sat in a tin trunk in the dark, and no one alive knew it was there, until a discarded mule who had spent a whole life pulling and hauling and being told what to do stood at that iron door for 17 days, because some part of him could not abide a thing shut up and forgotten in the dark, and pushed it open so that I would have no choice but to look. I sat on the floor of that little room, and I read until my flashlight dimmed, and then I crawled back out into the cold starlit yard, and I put my arms around my old mule's gray neck, and I cried for Eli and for Ada and for my husband in the front room, and for all of us the world decides it is finished with. And Solomon stood like a warm gray wall and let me, and did not move until I was done. The next morning I drove the rattling farm truck into Harlow, and from there to the county seat, and I carried one bundle of those letters wrapped in a clean dish towel as carefully as if it held something alive, and I walked into the little county historical society, a one-room place run by volunteers in the old bank building, and I asked the woman behind the desk whether she had ever heard of a hired man named Eli Mercer, who was supposed to have stolen the Garrett payroll in 1931. She was a small, sharp, white-haired woman in her 70s named Doreen, and when I said those two names, her face went still, and she sat down slowly in her chair, and she told me that the Mercer business was the oldest scandal in the county, that it was in the local history books as a closed case, the thieving hand who got away, and that there were Garretts living yet, and there were Mercers, too, an old, poor, shamed family that had carried the name of that supposed thief for 3 generations. And she asked me, in a voice gone careful and strange, where in God's name I had gotten those letters. The man who came was named Tom Mercer, and he was 78 years old, and he was the grandson of Eli Mercer's younger brother, which made him as near to family as the dead man had left in the world. He came into that little museum in his good shirt because Doreen had told him on the telephone what I had found, and an old farmer who has spent his whole life under the shadow of a name, puts on his good shirt to come and hear it lifted. He sat down across the table from me, and he looked at the bundle of letters for a long time without touching them, and then he laid one knotted, sun-spotted hand flat on top of them, the way a man lays his hand on a grave, and he said, in a voice that shook, that his grandfather had gone to his own death, never speaking his brother Eli's name above a whisper, that the family had moved counties twice to get out from under it, that he himself had been called the thief's kin in the schoolyard 65 years ago, and had never once been able to say it was a lie, because he had no proof. Nobody had any proof. There was only the story everybody knew. And I opened the bundle, and I laid into his old shaking hands the page that began, "Whoever finds this, I am not the thief they will tell you I was." And I watched Tom Mercer read his grandfather's brother's words, written in the dark of that silo 80-some years gone. And I watched the thing happen to his face that I would see happen again and again in the weeks that followed, a kind of breaking and a kind of lifting both at once. The shame of 3 generations running off him like water, and something clean and stunned coming up underneath. He read it twice, and then he could not see to read it a third time, and he put the page down very gently on the table, and he covered his eyes with his hand, and his shoulders shook, and Doreen came around the desk and stood beside him with her hand on his back, and I sat across from a stranger and cried with him for a man neither of us had ever met. What happened after that happened the way good things do once they finally start, all in a rush after the long still years. The Historical Society took the whole trunk into its keeping, the letters and the ledger and the pages of Eli's account, and a young woman from the State University who studied such things came down and read every word, and the truth that Eli Mercer had set down about who really took that payroll proved out against the county records exactly as he had written it, down to the dates and the names. They put it in the regional paper, and then it traveled the way a story like this travels, a story with an innocent man and a faithful woman and a mule in it. And the Garretts came forward, too, the great-grandchildren of the family that had let an innocent man take the blame, and to their lasting credit, they did not hide from it. They stood up in the meeting room of that little museum and said the name of their own great-aunt Ada, who had loved a poor man and hidden him and kept his secret all her life. And they asked the Mercers' forgiveness for a thing none of them living had done, but all of them had inherited, and the 2 old families that the lie had driven apart for 80 years sat down together at last, in the same room. I watched the 2 families come together over those weeks, and it was the finest thing I have ever been let to witness. An old Garrett man, near as old as Tom, drove up from Oklahoma with his daughter at the wheel, and the 2 old men, the grand-nephew of the woman who hid him and the grand-nephew of the man she hid, who had never in their lives laid eyes on one another, stood in the gravel lot outside the museum and shook hands a long time without quite knowing what to say. And then the Garrett man said he was sorry, just that, I am sorry. And Tom Mercer said there was nothing for him to be sorry for, he had not been born. And the Garrett man said that was just the trouble with a sin like this one. It gets handed down to people who were not born to do it and have got to be the ones to set it down. And the 2 of them went in out of the cold together. The young woman from the university read the love letters aloud at the dedication, a few of them, the gentle ones, and there was not a dry eye in that little room. And afterward, A Mercer girl, maybe 16, came up to me and said that her whole life, her family had been the family that something bad was attached to, and that she had never understood until that day that it had not been their bad thing at all. It had been done to them, and that she felt as if a stone she had been carrying without knowing its name had been lifted clean off her. They cleared Eli Mercer's name. The county records were amended, which is a small dry thing on paper, and was the largest thing in the world to the people in that room. The Historical Society raised a proper stone for him because his bones were never found, and there had never been a marker. And they set it in the Harlow Cemetery beside a stone for Ada Garrett. The two of them laid to rest side by side at last. And on Eli's stone they did not put the word thief. They put the words, a good man, wrongly accused, found at last, and the date they reckoned he had died alone in the silo in the spring of 1932. There was no money in that trunk. I never found a single coin in the whole of that silo, and I have never in my life been gladder of anything, because if there had been money, some mean small part of me would always have wondered whether I did the rest of it for the right reasons. As it was, there was nothing down there but the truth, and the only thing a person can do with the truth is give it back to the people it belongs to. And giving it back turned out to be the thing that gave me my own life back. Because here is what I had not understood, broke and bitter and grieving on that failed farm. I thought I had lost everything that could matter when I lost my husband and the house and every dollar to his name. I thought I had nothing left in me to give to anybody. And then a worn-out mule that the world had thrown away led me to the proof of a wrong that had outlasted everyone who did it. And in handing the truth back to the families it had broken, I found I was not empty after all. The town of Harlow, which had known me for a month as the strange widow camped out on the old Garrett place, came to know me as the woman whose mule found the truth. And a thing happens to you when a near-dead town decides to take you in. Tom Mercer turned out to know more about wheat and well water and broken roofs than any 10 books, and he came out to the farm to help me. And then his sons came, and then half of Harlow seemed to have a reason to be out on that quarter section on a Saturday, and the failed farm I had bought to hide and die on slowly, quietly, stopped failing. We did not make the place into anything grand. The Historical Society took the little room at the base of the silo and left it exactly as it was, the iron cot and the sheet iron stove and the canvas coat on its nail and the tally marks on the wall, and put a glass door on it and a few lights. And it is a small museum now to Eli and Ada and the hard year of 1931, and Tom Mercer cut the ribbon on it himself in a new shirt, and he is the one who tells the story to the school groups that come, 'cause it is his story. It always was. It only took 80 years and an old mule to give it back to him. The rest of the farm I have slowly mended. The roof is sound now, and the well runs clean, and there is winter wheat coming up green again on the quarter section that grew nothing but failure for a generation, and I sell it and I get by, which is all I ever asked. Solomon lives wherever Solomon pleases, which is mostly in the new grass beside the silo, dozing in the afternoon sun against the cool concrete. An old gray mule with the freedom of the whole farm, who has chosen for his own the one spot where he once kept his long and faithful watch. People ask me, when they come to see the little room and hear the whole of it, how a mule could possibly have known. I do not have an answer that would satisfy a scientist. I know that mules were bred 1,000 years to work alongside men, to pull what men could not pull, and to find their own footing in the dark where men go blind. And I know that the silo was sealed up tight and dry and ought to have given off no smell that an animal could read. I do not think Solomon smelled the letters. I think he felt, in whatever way a great patient animal feels such things, the 80 years of a man waiting to be heard down there in the dark, one cast-off creature recognizing another and being what he was, born to labor and to faithfulness. He simply could not leave the work undone. He pushed the door open the only way he could. He made me do the rest. Tom Mercer stood beside me at the dedication of the little room, an old man whose family name had been a curse before it was a blessing, and he looked at my gray mule asleep in the sun against the silo, and he said a thing I have not stopped turning over since. He said his own grandfather used to tell him that the prairie keeps every secret it is given, but it does not keep them forever. It only holds them down in the dark until the right plow turns them up into the light. I had spent a year and a half believing I was the one who had been turned under and buried, the widow nobody wanted, foreclosed and written off and gone to ground on a failed farm at the edge of a dying town. It turned out I was the one who came to turn the secret up, and it turned out the right one, the patient one who knew there was something in the dark and would not rest until I followed him down to it, had been standing at my fence in the gray of every morning the whole time, gone gray at the muzzle, gentle as the evening, an old discarded mule waiting for me to be ready to walk with him out across the field and bring a good man, at long last, home into the light.